Dear civil service students, today we are going to discuss current affairs. During the past few months, two protests have been in focus in international news. One is the Yellow Vests protest in France, and the other is the protests for democracy in Hong Kong. Let us take up the Yellow Vests protest first. The Yellow Vests protest started in October 2018 and built up into full force by the middle of November 2018. It started as a protest against the rise in fuel prices. There is a rule in France that every motorist must keep a yellow vest in his vehicle and must wear it in an emergency. The protesters started wearing the yellow vests as it created a sense of emergency and also gave them a distinct identity. Initially, everyone considered these to be just incidental protests that would die down soon. But over the past half a year or so, they have spread and become violent. So far, 12 persons have been killed and properties worth millions destroyed in protests. The latest is that yesterday protesters damaged properties and attacked the police. Day by day, protests have been turning into mob violence.
The government says these were the most violent protests in Paris in over 50 years. On Saturday, 133 people were injured and more than 400 were arrested. The movement began 3 weeks ago on social media, with calls to protest attacks on fuel. But it's grown into a working-class revolt against the economic policies of President Emmanuel Macron. The yellow vests that Jimmy and others are wearing have become a symbol. A law requires drivers to carry them, so they're easier to spot. Now, it's making their movement harder to ignore. The taxes are designed to push drivers off the road to lower emissions. But people who can't afford to live in cities see it as a tax on the poor. Macron's Interior Ministry responded to the violence by deploying almost 70,000 officers, including 5,000 in Paris.
If the government thought that the extra security was going to calm protesters down, they were wrong. They've been here since 8 in the morning, and the police have been tear-gassing them all day.
By the afternoon, violent protesters were flipping cars and setting them on fire.
Now, the protests in Hong Kong. The protests for freedom in Hong Kong are against a legal amendment sought to be brought about by the government of Hong Kong. The bill for this amendment is known as Extradition Law Amendment Bill, or ELAB. If this bill is passed, the government of Hong Kong will get the authority to extradite persons accused in cases to countries like Taiwan and mainland China, with which Hong Kong does not have an extradition treaty. The apprehension of the people of Hong Kong is that passing of this amendment will surrender the autonomy of Hong Kong to the government of China. Thus, ELAB is seen as a step towards surrendering the autonomy of Hong Kong to mainland China. Earlier in 2014, the people of Hong Kong had organized what came to be known as the Umbrella Revolution, the purpose of which was to demand democratic reforms. These reforms have not yet seen the light of the day. Therefore, the present anti-ELAB protests are seen as a continuation of the Umbrella Revolution. The protest has been massive and has seen participation by millions of people. The protesters have been able to successfully stall the bill. However, the protest has been becoming more and more violent, with the authorities also becoming more tough. The latest development is that as on 15th September 2019, a group of pro-Chinese protesters have clashed with the protesters for democracy.
The people of Hong Kong are out in the streets.
呢個遊行對香港嘅未來可以話係歷史性嘅一刻咯，係香港
Hundreds of thousands are demonstrating against a deeply unpopular bill.
呢個會影響全香港嘅市民。
因為呢條條例對香港嘅傷害係非常之大嘅。
But this is about a whole lot more than a bill. It's about the status of Hong Kong and the power China has over it.
The Yellow Vests protests in France and the anti-ELAB protests in Hong Kong are different from the type of protests that the world has seen so far. In these protests, the social media have been the main medium for communication among public. As a result, these have become mass movements without the usual political background and clear leadership patterns of earlier protests. We had similar mobilization through the use of social media on Marina Beach in 2017 to protest against a Supreme Court ruling against the bullfight. Such protests could be the forerunners of the protests of the future, where masses rise in millions against real or perceived issues. And this mobilization takes place through messages passed on through the social media. In France, the protests arose over a rise in oil prices, but now these protests have developed a number of other strands. Many among the French believe that Russia is exploiting the protests to provoke violence against the rich.
It's not only just a citizen protest, it's also a very violent one because of some people from the far left and the far right.
While on the one hand, such protests could have the potential for providing a model for directly expressing the frustrations and the grievances of the masses, they also pose the danger of mobilizing leaderless mobs motivated by messages on the social media. And what is worse, powers that remain in the background could exploit these mobs for some hidden agenda of theirs. Now, what type of questions could you get about these protests, either in the preliminaries or the mains examinations? You may get a question about who are Yellow Vests, and you may be given misleading options like they are the football team of so-and-so country. About ELAB, they may give the option that it is a new laboratory to study the flow of electricity through the cell. You should know that it is a legal amendment. They may give you the option that umbrella revolution is the invention of a new type of umbrella. I am sure after watching this video, you will know what to answer. In an essay on the changing face of democracy, you could cite these protests as the new way of expressing support or opposition and of mobilizing crowds through the social media. On an essay on the role of social media, you can highlight how the social media can cause huge mobilization, which can also be exploited by forces that operate from behind the scenes. Today, under current affairs, we have discussed two important protests which have been in focus for the past few months. If there is any topic that you'd like me to discuss, please let me know. I would be happy to do that. And all the best for your preparation.